That's very interesting. And that leads me to the question around why should people in the cities care about these struggles?
So I think my answer to that question would be, I think people should care because I think there's one land story in South Africa. So, I don't think that there's an urban land story and a rural land story. There's one story. And that story is a story about dispossession, the forced removal of people, both in what we call rural and urban places. And it's also a story of, this key question about how do we address that? How do we rectify that? And how do we do that in a way that empowers people? And so, what I'm intrigued by in listening to Declan is, there are students who are here from families that might be in rural areas. There are students who are here from, peri-urban, the periphery of urban centers. And likewise, the work that we do is with people who are on the periphery. So it seems to me that the reason why I would say people should care is because there's one land story, and that's a story about people who have been marginalized, people who have been put on the edges. And the key question that is everybody's question as a country, and finding the answer to it is all of our responsibility, is how do we address that? How do we rectify that? And the kind of second point that I would make as I close is I think people know what they need. Whether you're dealing with, a fishing community in the West Coast, whether you're dealing with a community that's affected by mining or, that is dealing with a difficult traditional leader, people already have a sense of what the solutions could look like for themselves. And so, in our overarching theme that we're discussing today about human rights, I think part of what perhaps we really need to continue to bring to the foreground of that conversation in this country is that human rights aren't about saving people. It's not about, swooping in and fixing, but actually human rights are about starting in those communities and adopting a bottom-up approach that says, okay, you understand best what it means that there's gentrification in your area. You understand best what it feels like to have nowhere to stay when you're studying. You understand best what it feels like to be oppressed, because your graveyards and family history is going to be decimated by a mine. So the solutions start within the communities, not from kind of, our lofty perches outside of those spaces. And so for me, I really would say that for those reasons, the fact that there is one land story and that the question about how we improve things, correct things, is a question for all of us, is why people should care.
People would argue that there are many land stories in this country.
Of course,
that's something. Declan, I'd like to hear your reflections.
So the question of access to land is fundamental in closing the income gap, and that line between that ever-growing divide between the rich South Africans and those majority living in poverty, and therefore South Africans and people in general should care about this question, because it is so fundamental to the economy of South Africa and building the economy of South Africa by giving individuals access to land and thereby empowering them to contribute to the economy through production, whether it's of your food, of farming cattle and producing materials and so on and so forth. I fully agree that access to land is very necessary as a human right, and a very necessary starting point to see the not the achievement, but for this country to reach the aspirations that are contained in the Bill of Rights.
Nolundi, I want you to reflect a little. You talked about focusing on marginalized people, marginalized communities, but we also know that people are not marginalized in the same way. As a closing question then, what do you think needs to be done in resolving some of these issues that you've talked about here today?
Sure. So on the point about women, I think that, if we're talking about groupings of people, communities of people who are vulnerable in various ways, women are, twice as vulnerable. There's an additional vulnerability. And so in our work, we found that it's really necessary to be mindful of the fact that you can't think of communities as kind of a homogenous whole. You've got to break them apart and recognize that different people are impacted differently, have different forms of access and have different types of challenges. And so, some of what we were talking about earlier around the particular challenges that rural women face when it comes to land are these challenges that are based on these kind of traditional conceptions of the role of women, right? So women as, needing to kind of find a place in a marriage, in a married home, this idea of kind of women as, providers of kind of food, comfort, and establishing a home, but ultimately not being empowered and perhaps reconceptualizing their role as being about carrying a home, as possibly being about heading a home. And so those types of challenges, the particular kind of solutions or approaches that would improve their position is part of what we're trying to think about too as we work on these issues. And then the really hard question, what do we do, right? What needs to be done? Gosh, I mean, look, I think continuing conversations is critical. I think that if we don't talk about this and we, are happy to kind of turn a blind eye or to think about those problems as other people's problems, we're never going to get anywhere, right? That needle is going to be stuck ad infinitum. I also think that the state really needs to come to the party. I think it needs to take a different approach, certainly, in the context of rural land. What we've been doing for the last 25 years is not working. We really need to reassess because something has got to give. I really do think that without being alarmist, I do think that this is an issue that could really strike at the heart of whether South Africa has a meaningful democracy or a hollow democracy. And it feels to me like the urgency of it, the pressing nature of it, has us really sitting on a precipice, actually. And I do think that people need to apply our minds to adopting, as I say, these kind of bottom-up community-led approaches, but coupled with, a state that's willing to hear, to listen, to respond.
Thanks for that, Nolundi. And Declan?
Now, equally, the state really needs to come to the party. And we have these ongoing debates that boil through Parliament around expropriation of land without compensation. Personally, for me, I think that land does need to be, the starting point is for land to be expropriated, placed under the custodianship of the state, and then reallocated to the people to allow different economic activities to take place. Of course, we can have many debates around property ownership rights and whether the land when reallocated should be owned or leased. But I think as a starting point, conversations, as you said, and then the state coming to the party, expropriating land, and then reallocating it to the people.
Thank you so much to both of you. This has been a very interesting conversation for me, and I hope people find it as interesting and insightful as I have found it. We clearly have a long way to go from both what you've been sharing with us today. Okay, this is an ongoing conversation. You can follow us on social media, UCT Alumni pages, and also connect with us on UCT Alumni Connect. Thank you.